Thanks, Rick, for the invitation, and thanks, Charlie, for sharing the platform with me, and thank you for attending tonight. I should say, speaking truth to administration is probably why I'm an adjunct professor today. So this topic is one that's been near to my heart for quite some time. Because what I've really struggled with is to make sense of my hometown, right? My hometown is Portsmouth, Ohio, which we don't claim anything to do with J.D. Vance. That's at least one good thing. But Portsmouth, as I grew up in it, was a really good place to grow up. It was a somewhat vibrant, healthy, small town. And as I'm going to talk about, it's been devastated over the last 20 to 40 years. So what I'm going to do tonight is kind of tell its story as a way to generalize in terms of what's happening to rural America across the U.S. and across Canada. And I can't help but bring in some historical, philosophical, theological insight into the telling of the story. So I'm going to try to merge those all together. But I'm going to start with the important thing, which is football. So those of you who are solid Detroit Lion fans will know the history that once upon a time the Detroit Lions were the Portsmouth Spartans. Portsmouth during the 20s was a kind of growing small town, and football in a large part was centered in that neck of the woods at that point. And there used to be a lot of kind of semi-pro teams that industry would sponsor. And it's kind of out of that the NFL grew originally. So by the time we hit 1930, Portsmouth actually is granted an NFL team. Not quite the status that's attached to it today, but still a significant event, right? It was a mark that this is an up-and-coming, all-American town. So much so that they built a new stadium, which was utterly modern at that point in time. Concrete. They end up putting lights in, at least temporary lights. So they held the first ever night game for the NFL in Portsmouth. Portsmouth Spartans were also known for having the first indoor game. They played the Chicago Bears for the championship in 1932, and a blizzard hit in Chicago. So instead of playing at Wrigley Field, they moved to the old Chicago Stadium, which had just recently had a circus. And so the floor was covered with dirt and sawdust, and they played this football game on a 50-yard field where they would turn around halfway, often falling into elephant dung, apparently, as part of the game. I bring this up not just because there's amazing stories about the Portsmouth Spartans. They leave, by the way, in 1934 and eventually find their way here to Detroit and become the Lions. But I tell this as a way to get into it because it truly was a mark of significance about this small town. The other small town that you know that still has an NFL team is Green Bay, right? And Green Bay kind of lives and dies with the Packers, and that would have been true for the Spartans. They still tell the stories. It's significant to their identity because they're recognized by the world, right? They're playing New York, they're playing Philadelphia, they're playing Chicago, the major metropolitan areas, and now Portsmouth being recognized as a significant enough place that teams are going to travel there. So, how do you become an all-American town? There's a great cartoon that's produced in 1938, one of the first color cartoons, called All's Fair at the Fair. And it tells the story of this farmer couple who leave the farm and go to the equivalent of a World's Fair. And as they walk into the World's Fair, they've parked their horse and buggy, and what they end up experiencing is all the latest, greatest technology, and all they have to do is put a quarter into the slot. Suddenly there's a house, another quarter, and there's a bed and furniture being made for them. And the question I always ask my students when I show this to them is, what's changed about the couple by the end? So when they leave the fair, they're driving away in a roadster car that they've bought, which, by the way, when they put their quarter in, it says down payment, obviously. So it wasn't just purchasing at that point, it was introducing credit. But when I asked them what's really changed about the couple, the answer I'm looking for is their desire. Right? By the time they leave, they're not living in the next world, if you will. They're going back to the same farm they came from. But by the time they return to that farm, they're different people. They want a different life at that point. Charles Taylor wrote a book a few years ago called Secular Age, and he spends a significant amount of the time in Secular Age talking about what he describes as social imaginaries. And what he means by social imaginaries are these images and stories and symbols that kind of transfer culture. So as a philosopher, right, the story often goes something like, well, there's this argument made by Hobbes and Descartes in 1500, 1600, and people get convinced of the rightness of their ideas, and the world changes. And Taylor kind of pulls the rug out from under that understanding and says, no, if you think about it, what really makes the change into modernity is the way the people begin to imagine the future differently. So instead of thinking about the future solely in terms of that story that's told in church on Sunday, heaven or hell, now the future is told in terms of this infinite myth of infinite progress. That through technology and science, we're going to conquer the world, we're going to create the world that we want. It's going to be the world in which we can exercise our desires. Our desires become the blueprint, if you will. That's what happened to any number of small towns and rural areas in the early part of the 20th century. They're told, hey, it's time to move off the farm, right? Your income and lifestyle on the farm is way too unstable. You don't know when you're not going to have a good crop. You don't know when you're going to go hungry. Come work in the factory, get a stable job, and you can buy stuff. You can get what you really desire. If you ever pause and ask yourself, what in the world would lead someone to go off a farm and work 10 to 12 hours in a dirty, hard factory? It's not the appeal of the job. It's the future that's being promised by the wages that you receive from the job. Portsmouth embodies this, right? It's a small market town on the river. It's always been a port, so there's always been goods coming in and out. But it never had dreams of itself becoming Cincinnati or Pittsburgh until industrialization begins to take place. And now there's aspirations to be something bigger, to be the all-American town in some ways. And lo and behold, the promise gets realized, right? These factories come, the shoe stores or shoe factories come, eventually the steel factory follows. There are great paying jobs, and the population expands, and the tax base expands, and the opportunities become rampant, right, in a way. One of the ways I really like to think about this is from a philosopher by the name of Enrique Dussel from Mexico. He talks about the whole movement in modernity being a movement from the capitals, capital cities, to the peripheries. So he's talking about colonialism and the movement from the capitals of Europe into the New World, but the similar movement is taking place from urban area to rural. That is, the rural areas, these small towns, are being remade in the urban image. So to have a football team, here's a mark. To have a hotel and an opera house, here's a mark, right? You're arriving when you're able to kind of fund a good life for your people and provide the basic, not just services, but provide the opportunity to pursue the desires that they now have as modern people. And then the 1970s and 80s and 90s take place. Right? What happens when the promise melts, when it goes away? So as I said, I grew up in the 70s in Portsmouth, and it was still a good small town, right? You played Little League, you went to church, and people had jobs that gave them a decent standard of living. By the end of the 70s, the major employer, U.S. Steel, had basically gone out of business, right, in many parts of the country. And Portsmouth was one of the first places that they withdrew from. The number of people who suddenly became unemployed or didn't have a sustainable wage were a huge percentage of the town. Didn't happen instantaneously, but over the next 20 years, U.S. Steel leaves, and then all the kind of subordinate little companies that supplied U.S. Steel go bankrupt, and truly the flow reverses. Instead of people and resources flowing into Portsmouth, just like the floodwaters in 1937 of the Ohio River, it floods and it leaves behind decimation, right? Just tragic. If you've heard about Portsmouth in the last 20 years, it's probably been one or two books that you've heard about it through. One is a book entitled Dreamland. Dreamland is an account of the opioid crisis in small town America that was taking place 10 to 15 years ago. There was just another settlement this week, I think, on some of that. But Portsmouth was known as the pain pill capital of the U.S. And if you drove through Portsmouth 10 or 15 years ago, you drove through dilapidated neighborhoods. You saw warehouses and factories that no longer were kept upright, just collapsing in on themselves. Now, to be fair, there's good neighborhoods still in Portsmouth, too. Not every neighborhood look like this, but the chances of you coming across someone overdosing on heroin or some other drug in a fast food restaurant was significant in Portsmouth, right? It was a scary place to be at that point. Ironically, the book titled Dreamland comes from, up in the corner there, the pool that used to be in town. Dreamland was, if you were of status in Portsmouth, what you got was a pass to the Dreamland Pool Company in the summer. That's where my mom spent her summers as a bathing beauty. Right? Dreamland comes to mean the status of someone on heroin who's floating away, trying to get away from it all. The other book where Portsmouth got featured was a book called Dignity by Chris Arnott, who is a photographer. And the book consists of the forgotten places of the U.S. But at the center of that book is several photographs of Portsmouth. This is the centerfold. This is a homeless father with his two kids. And you can't tell from there, but it's a McDonald's parking lot. And he's taking his kids to McDonald's to try to get some food to survive for the day. If you know the area at all, you know that Dreamland Pool used to be just to the left of where he's standing. What's there now? Loans, payday loan companies, and liquor stores, right? The collapse is almost sort of complete in a way. Well, let's stay here for a second. So, what's left, right, when money, wealth, power, tax bases leaves? Not much, apparently. And what is there to do about it? Well, when the nation started to take kind of interest in what was happening in rural America, along about the time that Hillbilly Elegy gets published, but before that even, the realization is there's not much we can do about it, right? Kind of capitalism and the economic benefits of it are constantly moving, and this place has just happened to be the one of many that's going to be left behind. There's no fixing it. There's a famous article in the National Review by Kevin Williamson entitled "The Big White Ghetto." And he's talking about the area around Portsmouth just south in Kentucky, and he's describing it. And at the end of the article, he says, the only hope for this place is to leave. Just abandon it. If you have the resources to get out, right? And as Rick pointed out at the beginning of the lecture, that's what Americans have been doing for about the last 100 years, actually. That somewhere around 60% of Americans lived in small towns in rural America at the turn of the 18th into the 1900s. The last census, it's now below 15%. If you drive into northern Michigan, you see this just as easily, right? Not if you go to Traverse City, but if you go up and go to the right and go to a place like Johannesburg or over towards Alpena, there's been no economic revival taking place there, right? And it gets replicated over and over again. By far, Portsmouth's not the only place. It just happened to be the one that got noticed for a while because of some of the stuff that was going on there. One thing that's really helped me to understand this is the work of Zygmunt Bauman. And Zygmunt Bauman is a philosopher, sociologist. And he came up with the term liquid modernity, which to me is much more apt than the term post-modernity that's been bandied around some. By liquid modernity, he's talking about the fact that all the social institutions that we used to think were so solid and in place have kind of melted and liquefied at this point. They're unstable, indicated by untrustworthiness, right? Almost every institution we used to trust in has dropped off significantly in terms of how much we trust them at this point. So, Bauman talks about liquid modernity, and I think Portsmouth's a great example of how temporary and provisional the promise was. As long as it was economically viable, it provided a life. But the moment there was some question about the bottom line, it liquefied and flowed somewhere else. And what's left behind is just the debris, right, behind it. He has a subsequent book called Wasted Lives, and he says, if you think about the movement of progress in modernity, there's always waste left behind, both kind of literally in terms of what do we do with the trash, right, of our consumption, but also figuratively that somebody, some town, some region is always going to be sacrificed for what comes next, right? So, to me, that explains something like the creation of Appalachia, right? So Appalachian Mountains have been there, but Appalachian as a kind of political, social region doesn't actually come back around until the 1960s with the creation of the Appalachian region by President Johnson, largely because they wanted an address for poverty, right? If we're going to fix the problem, we got to know where it is. And so they end up creating this really kind of strange region that stretches from Georgia all the way up into New York City, or not New York City, up into New York State. An area has very little in common when you look apart there, other than there's a lot of poverty there. Now Appalachia becomes a region that is the problem, not has a problem. They're uneducated, they're kind of, backward, they're overly conservative and overly religious, and they can just be kind of dismissed for a while, right? And this is the time when Beverly Hillbillies and Hee Haw become popular on TV. The images of Appalachia become the hicks, right? And if they're suffering from poverty, it's because they're too stupid to get along with it. And I still remember, maybe the only thing I remember about my uncle saying directly, but I said something about Appalachian to him at one point, and my uncle, who was, no philosopher by any stretch, said, Appalachia, that's just the government's word. Doesn't describe us. And I think there's a way in which Appalachia has simply been constructed as a justification for the sacrifice of the region. The sacrifice took place, and now we got to figure out why we allowed it. If you think about the history of coal mines that go in West Virginia, and if you think about the steel and iron industry along the Ohio River, all that has suffered the economic consequences of being left behind in some way. So, a couple things and then I'll turn it over. One is, there's a really good book that's been recently published by a scholar by the name of Cat, in which the book title is What You Don't Understand About Appalachia. And I think one of the most important points that she makes, it's the one that Wendell Berry makes also, is that rural America is not homogeneous, right? The idea of creating Appalachia as this one big cultural place where we can kind of protect a certain kind of whiteness even is a creation that's done for political and economic reasons, not because that's actually what's transpiring there. And the accounts that you've read about here's where the Trump voter really lives, actually, when you dig into the numbers, is again telling a falsehood about what this region really is and what it's suffered. It's become, in some ways, again, a vehicle of justification for something it never has been or never will be. Let me conclude this portion with this. So my dad, who died 5 or 6 years ago, great highlight of his life at the end was he got to ride on the bypass that now goes around Portsmouth, Ohio. So this has been promised since the 1930s, because all the truck traffic that would come in for the steel mills, it would slow traffic down, and there had been discussion about they're going to build a bypass. So it was completed 15 years ago or so at great expense, going around a town which no longer has traffic, right? The reason for building it no longer matters, except guess what you don't have to see when you take the bypass? You don't have to see the destruction that's been left behind. So in some ways, the question that really bothers me in the end is, what's the way forward? Do we simply take the bypass, or are we willing to go home even when it's not what we want it to be?
Good.
Probably doing low tech, so
Right, low tech. Although I did enjoy seeing my home county, the neighboring county I currently live in, and the neighboring county of that Grove City where I teach, in the triangle I call my parish on that map. So, thank you. That was so good. I just want to ask you questions now. So I think what you'll see in this is some interesting overlaps, interesting I hope, and I think it's also going to take a personal turn for me here, so bear with me. Does rural America have a future? And I will say, when I preach, I go off like an outline and just talk to folks, but I am going to read this, but I want to get the words right tonight. Does rural America have a future? The title for our gathering this evening was supposed to, if it was supposed to raise eyebrows and interest in a slightly inflammatory way, I would say it worked, at least for me. Does rural America have a future? Well, as a nearly lifelong resident of rural America, with a year I spent in New Haven and 4 years in Charlottesville, Virginia, as exceptions, I certainly hope it has a future. Not just because I live there now, but because my children may live there decades from now. And even if all 4 of my children move away, many of the children who are growing up in our church or whom I am coaching in elementary basketball and little league softball will remain. As sociologists Tim Slack and Shannon Manat note in their 2024 book, Rural and Small Town America, geographic stability has been rising in America for some time, and that's counterintuitive. We don't think that's true, but it is. They say, quote, today fully half of all U.S.-born adults live within 50 miles of their place of birth. I'm one of those. Furthermore, and this might come as a surprise in a university town like this, they go on to note that the preference for stability is, quote, strong among the young and the old, the more and less educated alike. So part of the question is not whether folks will stay, but what will those who remain inherit? Of course, this is not the only question on the table. Stability itself is a divisive issue. Even though the trend towards stability seems to move against our cultural intuition about the transience and individuality of modern life, Americans' growing tendency to stay is something that has been noticed by more than academics. The headline of Yanni Applebaum's March 2025 cover story in The Atlantic said it all. Americans were increasingly stuck in place, as the headline read. Applebaum's nostalgia for the peripatetic days of yore is palpable. Quote, no society has ever been as mobile as the United States once was. No society has even come close. In the 19th century, the heyday of American mobility, roughly a third of all Americans changed address every year. It was wanderlust that, he says, left European visitors, quote, astonished and slightly appalled. This inclination, as one 19th century newspaper reporter that Applebaum quotes puts it, cut loose, quote, cut loose from the old styles of human vegetation, you can hear the condescension there, the former method of sticking like an oyster, more condescension, to one spot through the numberless succeeding generations. Like a jazz artist riffing on this 19th century trumpeter of modernity, Applebaum carries the migratory hope into a new century, noting that as the baby boom began, Americans kept on moving. And as Americans moved around, they moved up. At this point, you may be asking what this moving up entailed. I know I was. Well, that's a question Applebaum doesn't leave to the imagination. He tells us that these sturdy, upwardly mobile folks, quote, broke away from the stultifying social hierarchies, depleted farmland, declining towns, dead-end jobs. If the first move didn't work out, they could always see a more promising destination beckoning them onward. Indeed, in Applebaum's view, mobility led to most of the best things in American society. Entrepreneurship, he says, innovation, growth, social equity, the most appealing features of the young republic all trace back to this single foundational fact. Americans were always looking ahead to their next beginning, always seeking to move up by moving on. It's no wonder that he believes that this kind of mobility, and this is a direct quote, just may be America's most profound contribution to the world. This kind of mobility, according to Applebaum, quote, might be America's most profound contribution to the world. This seems to be more than hyperbole for him. What do we do with sentiments like this? How does this kind of upwardly mobile autonomy impact our culture? How does it impact rural and small town America specifically? Is the kind of easy mobility that Applebaum extols really an unmitigated good? Does it stand out among American innovations like the Declaration of Independence or the disestablishment of religion as one of our nation's greatest contributions to the world? I think questions like these deserve an answer. And I don't think the answer can come from just anywhere. The only way we can actually answer claims like those of Applebaum is from somewhere, from a real place, from within embodied communities. And that's what I hope to do tonight. I believe that rural America does have a future, but I think the quality of that future is up for grabs. I think there are reasons to believe, especially if one is a Christian, that there is hope for rural and small town America. I also believe that one aspect of realizing this hope is learning to see stability not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as a human need to be intentionally cultivated. Now, I want to offer a caveat. I don't want to imply them advocating some kind of caste system with no room for upward mobility or a kind of assigned geographical family inheritance like that practiced by the ancient Israelites. That's not what I'm saying. Having the freedom to choose is an essential part of love. Right? So if you get to choose to move back to your hometown, you can do it out of love. The problem isn't choice per se. Rather, I think the problem is that few of our culture's leading voices, people like Applebaum, with the exception of outliers like Wendell Berry and maybe a few in this room, stand as ever-ready reminders that the future is out there beyond the horizon. Even phrases like go big or go home that have entered into our common parlance. What do they say? Go big or go home. You can't do both. They're ever-ready reminders that those who can get out of rural America usually do and perhaps always should. Now, as both a child of rural America and the possessor of some degree of ambition, I've felt this tension most of my life. There have always been folks in my ear or voices in my head saying that certain things simply can't be accomplished from small places. Fortunately, these haven't been the only voices I've heard. The voices in my head have always been answered in a kind of call and response by the voices in my heart. From very early on, these voices, the voices of neighbors, family, friends, members of the congregation I grew up in, were a reminder that the world under my feet and the community that opened up around me each day held a goodness and potential worth appreciating, maybe even worth fighting for. As I grew in my faith, the voice of the Holy Spirit, with its persistent and gentle prodding, added a much-needed voice to the chorus. In my life, these voices were often in conversation with larger cultural narratives. Yes, I wanted to succeed, but I wanted to succeed with and for a community. Yes, I wanted to, quote unquote, go places, but I wanted to go places so I could take other people with me. Through all of this, self-doubt, the temptation to self-promote, they've never been far away. I'm convinced imposter syndrome stalks us all. But through the years, what kept drawing me back to the place and people was love. For me, the only path through the thicket of ambition, autonomy, and the mobility that both often lead to was the stability born of love. To put it simply, I think one of the biggest indicators of hope in rural America is the degree to which people love the corner of rural America they call home. That kind of specific and contextualized affection for people and place, for customs and ways of life together matters. St. Augustine understood that Christian love worked in the particularities of time and place and proximity to others. He said, quote, all people should be loved equally, but you cannot do good to all people equally, so you should take particular thought for those who, as if by lot, happen to be particularly close to you in terms of place, time, and any other circumstance. So tonight, I'll address the future of rural America not as an outside observer or a cultural pontificator, but as one who loves one corner of rural America, one that was just up on that screen actually, and can imagine others who love other portions of it at least as well. So I want to give you two stories tonight. One focuses on the formative power of place, and one focuses on the formative power of a person or a community who lived out a love for a place. I think These stories together illustrate how God used love to draw me to the beauty of home and birth a holy discontent that would eventually fuel my advocacy for rural people and places. So first, strip mine Jesus. I only moved once during my childhood. When I was almost 3, my family moved from one side of an unreclaimed strip mine to the other. This is literally true. If you look closely in those woods, you can still see the remnants of the trail my mom blazed with the family lawn tractor on her trips from our old house to the one my dad was building with me on her lap. The split-level home my dad built sat on 10 acres, an acre or two of which included a 15-foot-high clay bank strewn with bits of shale that descended into muddy clay and stagnant water-filled ravine. All telltale signs of strip mining, if you know it. Strip mining, by the way, takes the surface topsoil, gets rid of it, and if it's unreclaimed, just leaves the shale and clay in its wake. Purchasing property that included an unreclaimed strip mine didn't seem to bother my parents. Perhaps it was because strip mines were so common in our area. Anyone with a trained eye could easily drive through the surrounding countryside and pick them out. I still do this all the time when I drive. The partially reclaimed mines were flat, and the exposed clay was usually seeded with evergreen trees. The entirely unreclaimed mines were filled with high walls and hills and ravines and whatever plants could eke out an existence there. Unlike a nearby section of the mine that adjoined my parents' property, this section had some trees on it, my parents wasn't even graced with young stands of pine and spruce. The mine on the property my parents owned and that my dad marked out with 2-inch metal pipe that he repurposed from an earlier extraction process, oil, had no signs of rehabilitation. There were a few small trees here and there, but our strip mine was more brown than green, more clay, shale, hills, and mud than trees and leaves. And my brother and I loved it. Over the years, the strip mine became our primary playground. Some of my earliest memories are of throwing rocks in the pools and gathered in the clay-lined valleys. I think this is actually my earliest or second earliest memory. I remember picking huckleberries with my mom. And the joys of our strip mine, they changed with the seasons. In spring, we listened for peepers, caught tadpoles, learned about erosion by redirecting the runoff of April showers into waterfalls over the high wall. We rode bikes, looked for snakes, picked berries in the summer. The fall was full of long walks in crisp air, and once we were old enough, hunting for squirrels, rabbits, and white-tailed deer. In the winter, we used the largest pool as a personal ice hockey rink and went sled riding down the high wall. As we grew, we experimented with other uses for our bit of unreclaimed strip mine. Since there were usually only 2 of us, my brother and I had to be creative. We eventually figured out that our strip mine provided excellent setting for one-on-one paintball battles and our own version of American Gladiators. You have to be old enough to understand what that was. And this involved one of us driving our 1986 Honda 3-wheeler as fast as we could across the strip job while the other one shot at us with a paintball gun, and you tried not to get hit. As kids, my brother and I were mostly oblivious to the larger environmental and ecological questions that surrounded strip mining. All we really knew was that we loved our small, shale-strewn corner of the world. Our love for the strip mine wasn't rooted in a desire to see ecological restoration, though we did participate in that. We planted a lot of trees back there. We didn't know the lasting implications that accompanied the hard use of the land. What we did know was that we loved this place, and the more we spent time walking its paths and attending to its particularities, the more we found to love. Even as we grew up and learned to see the hills and ravines as the exposed scars of poor stewardship that they were, we still loved the place. Once it had been used and thoughtlessly abandoned as a means to an end, now, at least for my brother and me, it was beloved. One of life's most important lessons, I think, is that love changes things. The love my brother and I felt for our strip mine was no exception. Our love for this particular place made us look for opportunities to invite others into the goodness we found. Beauty always draws, and love is beautiful. I doubt our love for the strip job was lost on any of our childhood friends. One of the first things when friends did sometimes come to our house, we lived pretty far out and went to a little Christian school a county away, so we didn't have a lot that were close. But when we got them to come, the first thing we often did was hand them an extra bike and take them to our favorite bit of man-made topography. We couldn't wait to share a bit of our life, the trails, the huckleberries, the opportunity to test our bike riding skills against the shale and clay with our friends. And when they joined us in our beloved track of clay and shale, they often came away with enduring memories that I still encounter decades later when I run into them. And more important than any of this was another reality I experienced in the strip mine, and that was that God met me there. Throughout my life, I've had moments in which God met me in an experience of joy that seemed to envelop me. I have felt this kind of joy the first time I stepped on a hardwood basketball court in first grade. I can still remember smiling so much I felt awkward because I couldn't stop. I just loved it. The same thing happened frequently to me in the strip mine. I remember going for a run in the mine on the afternoon I finished my first year as a high school English teacher. I ran, I smiled, I prayed, and I basked in the joy of a task accomplished and the goodness of God. I can remember the joy of looking on from the top of the high bank as my mom, dad, and brother skated on the ice below. Now, not every talk with God in the mine was joyful. Over the years, when melancholy or loneliness, and there's been a good bit of both, crept in, I often made my way to these familiar acres to walk and pray. At other times, my strip mine prayers were intercessory. I can remember standing atop the high wall, praying through tears for my friends to know the Lord, and later for the nearby town of Oil City and our dream of planting a church there. It's no wonder that when I first learned about the Christian practice of imaginative prayer and the tradition of Ignatius Loyola, and was instructed by one author to, quote, locate a place in your memory that's pleasant, serene, and easy to recall vividly, I knew exactly where to go. I chose a specific corner of the strip mine as a place to regularly sit with Jesus in my mind. The practice felt almost intuitive. I had been meeting Jesus on this bit of sacred ground for years. But it wasn't just places that formed me, that taught me how to be an invitational presence. It was people. I have time for one short story. I can't remember the first visit to the storefront dental office at 524 Main Street in Knox, Pennsylvania, population 1,089. But I'm sure my mom secured an appointment for me as soon as my teeth began pushing through. The first visit I do remember came a few years later when Dr. Dale Myers removed an abscessed tooth when I was about 8. I distinctly remember that. In the more than 3 decades since, I've spent many hours in the same dental chair, fortunately never for another abscessed tooth, but there have been fillings, preventative care. One time in college at a basketball practice, my front teeth were almost knocked out. Of course, I went to Dr. Myers. I scheduled visits there around breaks when we moved out of state. In high school, over the years, my relationship with Dr. Myers gradually expanded beyond the walls of his dental office. As I became an active member of my community, I had the chance to experience Dr. Myers as a leader in other spheres of life. When the church I attended started a youth group during my junior year of high school, Dr. Myers served as a founding member of the youth committee. He was also a regular presence at high school and community-wide events where his distinctive wave and chipper hello were well known. Each of these interactions helped me better understand one of my town's most prominent professionals. But the single greatest change in my relationship with Dr. Myers came on a blustery day in October 2007 when I married his daughter. It was this shift in relationship that gave me new insight into Dale's story. As I came to learn, it was a story full of intentionality and faithfulness. Dale had chosen this work in this place as a practical expression of love. Here's how it went. Following his 1970 graduation from the local high school, he enrolled in the local college next town over in the county seat, Clarion University. Within 2 years, he had married his high school sweetheart, and as for the rest of his future, he found himself torn between a desire to pursue an advanced degree in chemistry or a career in the medical field. In the end, his decision to attend the University of Pittsburgh for his Doctor of Medical Dentistry degree was a decision informed by his natural inclination towards science and his affection for place. Even as a young man, he sensed that a career in chemistry would likely mean moving to wherever a job opened up, since there were predictably few openings for chemists in small-town Knox. Dentistry, however, allowed his scientific mind and his attention to detail to flourish while also offering him a chance to practice his profession in a place and among a people he loved. And that's what he did for 46 years. His dental office provided a hub of community, and it did this not just for patients, but for his long-term employees, some of whom served there for 3 or more decades. They benefited from a steady paycheck and an employer who took a genuine interest in their lives. Perhaps that's why my father-in-law's death in the summer of 2024 left such a big hole, not just in our family, but in his church and the wider community. He had practiced dentistry to put food on the table, sure, but he had also practiced dentistry as an act of love for a people and a place. It's no surprise to me that Dale's story, like the formative influence of the places that marked my childhood, has shaped my story. In my work with Grove City College's Center for Rural Ministry, I frequently talk to pastors who describe aging congregations and college students who are under the assumption that flourishing lives are most easily achieved in a large metropolitan area. When I think about how to help these students consider that they might be able to get back to the small towns they came from, or go for the first time to a rural area as a teacher, a preacher, a doctor, or a business leader, it's not the statistics or the reality of the need that they find convincing. I've seldom seen people sense a call to invest in a small place because of charts and graphs. I have, however, seen people catch a vision for what flourishing, interconnected life in a small place looks like by getting caught up in a story. When we send students to work alongside small-town pastors and lay leaders, more often than not, the students come back with a new appreciation for what's possible in a small place. They've learned a profession at college, but the stories they experience help them know how to love and become amateurs, in the best sense, lovers, right? That's what that word means. We need more of these impassioned professionals and amateurs in places everywhere. I know this is true because I've lived this story. In 2014, my wife and I were raising 2 young children as I completed my PhD at the University of Virginia. I had entered the program with a standard academic life in mind. I knew this would likely mean taking whatever job opened up in a tight academic market. Then something I didn't anticipate happened. I started to sense what felt like a call to move home. I thought I had pushed my love for places, people down, but it was still there. As my wife and I discerned a call to move to a small corner of western Pennsylvania to plant a church, we did encounter some folks in our circle of friends and family who thought we were making a decision that would negatively impact our financial security and our ability to flourish in our lives and careers. Against these headwinds, we found respite in an unsurprising place. When we told my father-in-law, the response was different. He knew what was possible, and thanks to him, so did we. Why do I tell you these stories? What do 2 stories, the story of my love for a place and a person who devoted his life to a community he loved, have to say to the question of rural America's future? I think they might have more to say than we think. Stories shape us. Stories fuel our imagination. One of the biggest problems of modern life, perhaps liquid modernity, I got to read that book, is that we have gotten caught up in the wrong story. A story centered on bigger and better, on power over, on celebrity, materialism, and a narrow vision of success. These are the elements in our cultural story that lead us to buy into the transience that Applebaum advocates for. They're also the elements of our story that lead to some of the things Applebaum says warrants our movement. Things like stultifying social hierarchies, depleted farmland, declining towns, dead-end jobs. I think this is where transience becomes part of the problem. Folks who plan to stay in a place for a lifetime and hope the same for their children and grandchildren are more likely to work to fix the aspects of rural life that are challenging. I'm not saying there are no challenges. I'm just saying these people are willing to work to find a solution, rather than let them slip into decline and decay. For instance, when we walked through Oil City when we first moved there, we saw a lot of buildings like the one in the middle of that picture. And what we started saying is that building needs a little love. And that's what our kids, as young kids, 3 and 4, they go through town, they're like, that building needs love. Like, yes, that is what it needs. For instance, a farmer who hopes his family will plant a plot of land for multiple generations won't let their soil become depleted quite as easily. Just as an employer who loves a small town might work extra hard to avoid making decisions that will push jobs overseas. I don't claim to be a policy head, though I do plan to learn a lot more because I'm on this Brookings and AEI Commission for Rural Prosperity, so pray for me. But I see the value in advocating for policies that favor what Slack and Manat describe as place-based initiatives rather than person-based. Here's the distinction. Person-based initiatives try to get people to leave Appalachia or wherever. Place-based ones try to help the place rebound. We have to form people whose love inspires them to stay, to build, to dream, and to repair. This kind of faithful presence is especially powerful for me when I consider the bigger picture from which the standpoint of Christian witness and theology. God remains faithfully present throughout his creation. That's a given. That means he's also faithfully present in the least populated corners of it. He isn't in the habit of abandonment. Rather, God's MO is redemption. And in small towns, redemption often starts with the same invitation that Philip offered his friend Nathanael when Nathanael doubted that the Messiah could come from a small place like Nazareth. To Nathanael's question, can anything good come from Nazareth? Philip simply extended an invitation. Come and see. We can still extend this invitation in small places today. We can share our lives, our stories, our belief that no matter how overlooked or underserved rural places seem in our current cultural moment, there is one who has never forgotten them. It just so happens that this one is also the same person who made them in the first place, who sustains them until his return, when redemption will reign, as Isaac Watts famously declared, far as the curse is found. No city or field will be overlooked then, so it makes sense that these places should not be overlooked now. This is Christian witness to redemption, to the hope of resurrection. It may not be a call for all of us, but I'm certain it is the call for some of us. My hope and prayer is that more folks can hear this call above the noise of a culture tuned only to bigger, better, and next. Thank you.